Man's search for meaning is not just about surviving the Holocaust, it's about the fundamental human need to find a why. If you want to find purpose in suffering, reclaim your mental agency, and master your inner response to any crisis, this book is essential. Written in 1946, in just 9 days, it remains a global masterpiece with over 16 million copies sold. Its legacy is more relevant today than ever, offering a cure for the existential vacuum of our modern, distracted world. The author's journey. Viktor Frankl was a prominent Viennese psychiatrist when he was stripped of his identity and sent to Auschwitz. He lost his wife, parents, and brother to the camps. He didn't just write about resilience, he tested his theories in the most brutal laboratory imaginable, proving that while we cannot avoid pain, we can choose how to cope with it. Who will read this? Anyone facing a personal winter, seeking career purpose, or looking for a reason to say yes to life. In this video, I'll break down the entire book, covering every important principle so that by the end, you'll understand its core message completely. We will journey through Frankl's harrowing survival in the concentration camps, explore the psychological mechanics of how the human mind adapts to trauma, and finally, master the core pillars of logotherapy. You won't just learn the history of this masterpiece, you will gain a practical toolkit for finding purpose in your own life, no matter how difficult your current circumstances may feel. Segment 1. The 3 phases of the camp. Phase 1. The admission. The psychology of shock. In the face of overwhelming trauma, the human mind initiates a delusion of reprieve as a survival mechanism to buffer the initial blow of a new reality. Frankl explains that upon entering the camp, prisoners experienced a pathological state of shock. This is a psychological defense where the individual refuses to accept the severity of their situation. It is often accompanied by the delusion of reprieve, a belief that somehow, at the last minute, they will be saved or that the situation isn't as deadly as it appears. As the shock wears off, it is replaced by a grim, detached curiosity. The mind begins to observe its own destruction as if it were happening to someone else. Frankl recalls the moment his transport arrived at the Auschwitz station. The prisoners saw SS men and the chimney, but clung to the hope that they were merely going to a work camp. He describes a fellow prisoner who, despite the surrounding horror, tried to keep his dignity by wearing a high-quality coat. This coat was a symbol of his old life, a life that was about to be stripped away. When the selection began, a simple wave of a finger to the left or right decided between immediate death in the gas chambers or slow death through labor. In that moment, the delusion shattered. Shock is the mind's way of pacing the intake of pain. However, to survive beyond the first few hours, one must quickly transition from wishing for a miracle to accepting the brutal facts of the present. When a sudden crisis hits, be it a job loss or personal tragedy, allow yourself the moment of shock, but recognize it as a temporary shield. Real resilience begins when you stop looking for the reprieve and start looking at the ground beneath your feet. The first step to surviving a nightmare is the brutal acceptance that you are, in fact, awake. Phase 2. The camp routine. The psychology of apathy. Prolonged suffering leads to a death of the soul, where apathy becomes a necessary emotional armor to protect the inner self from constant horror. As the initial shock fades, it is replaced by a second stage, deep apathy. Frankl describes this as an emotional death. The prisoner no longer averts his eyes from filth, beatings, or the dead. This lack of emotion is actually a highly effective survival mechanism. The mind shuts down its higher affective functions like disgust, pity, and indignation to conserve every ounce of energy for one goal: staying alive. The focus narrows entirely to the primitive needs of the body, a piece of bread, a bowl of watery soup, or a moment of rest. Frankl vividly recalls a fellow prisoner who died during the night. He watched with total detachment as other prisoners, driven by cold necessity, took the dead man's shoes, his coat, and finally his portion of soup. No one felt evil or sad. They were simply existing in a state of emotional rigor mortis. Frankl himself found that he could stare at a corpse while eating his own meager meal without losing his appetite. The sight of a child's suffering or a comrade's execution became just another part of the daily landscape. Apathy is a tool for survival, but it is also a dangerous trap. While it protects you from the pain of the present, it can cause you to lose sight of your human dignity and your future purpose. In periods of long-term burnout or chronic stress, you may feel numb or cynical. Recognize this as your mind's way of protecting itself from overwhelm. However, to truly recover, you must find small ways to re-engage your emotions through art, nature, or helping others. When everything is taken away, the most dangerous loss is not your comfort, but your capacity to feel. Phase 3. The psychology of the prisoner after release. Liberation is not a sudden return to happiness, but a complex process of depersonalization, where the mind must relearn how to feel and believe in reality again. Frankl observed that when the prisoners were finally liberated, they did not feel the joy they had dreamed of for years. Instead, they suffered from depersonalization. Everything seemed unreal, distant, and like a dream. The psychological pressure had been so great for so long that the mind couldn't simply snap back to normal. Furthermore, many faced a secondary trauma, disillusionment. After surviving the unimaginable, they returned home to find their loved ones dead or their homes gone. They felt that after all they had suffered, the world owed them something, but the world remained indifferent. Frankl describes the day of liberation. He and his fellow prisoners walked out of the camp gates, seeing the flowers and the freedom of the open fields, yet they felt nothing. One prisoner said, "I cannot say I am pleased." They literally forgotten how to be happy. Frankl recounts walking into the fields, falling to his knees, and finally breaking into tears, repeating a single sentence. "I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space." It took days, even weeks, for the taste of food and the beauty of nature to register as real again. Trauma does not end when the physical danger stops. The bitterness and disillusionment that follow are the final hurdles of the survivor. Recovery is not a light switch. It is a slow rebuilding of the soul's ability to trust life again. If you have ever reached a major goal, like finishing a degree or surviving a health crisis, and felt strangely empty or flat afterward, understand that this is a normal psychological delay. Give yourself the grace of time to reconnect with your emotions without forcing a happy reaction. Freedom is not just the absence of walls. It is the slow, painful process of remembering how to hope. Segment 2. Logotherapy in a nutshell. 1. The will to meaning. The primary motivational force in humans is not the pursuit of pleasure or power, but the fundamental search for a personal meaning. Frankl explicitly contrasts his theory with the two dominant schools of his time, Freud's will to pleasure and Adler's will to power. He argues that humans are not merely biological machines seeking to reduce tension or gain status. Instead, we are spiritual beings who can endure almost any physical how if we have a spiritual why. When this will to meaning is frustrated, it leads to existential frustration, where a person feels empty despite having every material comfort.
In the death camps, those who survived the longest were often not the physically strongest, but those who had an unfinished task waiting for them. Frankl recalls how he survived a bout of typhus by mentally rewriting a lost manuscript on scraps of paper. His will to meaning, the need to share his psychological discoveries with the world, gave his body the resilience to fight off a deadly fever that claimed many others who had lost their why. Meaning is not a luxury for the successful, it is a necessity for the suffering. It is a unique, specific pull that only an individual can fulfill, making each life irreplaceable. If you feel a sense of emptiness despite being successful, stop asking what you want from life and start looking for what life is currently asking of you. Find the one task that only you can do. Life is not a quest for pleasure, but a quest for a reason to be happy.
2. Existential frustration. Mental distress is not always a pathological mental illness. Often, it is a healthy sign of existential frustration, a spiritual struggle for a meaningful existence. Frankl coined the term noogenic neurosis to describe a conflict that arises not from psychological traumas or biological imbalances, but from existential problems. He argues that modern psychology often misdiagnoses people by looking into their past for repressed desires, when the real issue is a frustrated will to meaning. This tension is actually a prerequisite for mental health. We don't need a tensionless state. We need the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. Frankl mentions a high-ranking American diplomat who came to him for treatment after years of unsuccessful psychoanalysis. The diplomat was dissatisfied with his career and the international policies he had to implement. Previous doctors told him he had an unresolved relationship with his father. Frankl, however, saw that the man simply needed a more meaningful vocation. Once the diplomat changed his career to one that aligned with his values, his neurosis vanished. He wasn't sick, he was just in the wrong place. Discontent with your life or career is not necessarily a defect. It is your inner compass telling you that your current path is not fulfilling your unique purpose. If you feel a persistent sense of wrongness in your life, stop looking for what is broken in your mind and start looking for what is missing in your mission. Treat your frustration as a call to action rather than a symptom to be medicated away. A man's concern or even his despair over the worthwhileness of his life is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. 3. The existential vacuum. When humans lose their animal instincts and their cultural traditions, they're left with a void, a state of emptiness that leads to boredom, depression, and aggression. Frankl observed that modern humanity suffers from a loss of meaning that he calls the existential vacuum. In the past, instincts told us what we must do, and traditions told us what we should do. Today, we often don't know what we want to do. This vacuum manifests most clearly as Sunday neurosis, that specific depression people feel when the rush of the busy work week stops and they're suddenly confronted with the lack of content in their lives. To fill this void, people often turn to compensations like the pursuit of power, money, or excessive hedonism. Frankl often cited the rise of automation and increased leisure time as a double-edged sword. He noted that as people gained more freedom from work, they lacked a freedom for a purpose. He saw this in his clinical practice through patients who were physically healthy and wealthy, but felt a total lack of vitality. They weren't suffering from trauma, they were suffering from the boredom of a life without a mission. Boredom is a more serious psychological threat than many realize. It is the modern soul's warning light that it has no destination. If you find yourself constantly scrolling social media or seeking distractions the moment you are alone, you are likely avoiding the existential vacuum. Instead of filling the silence with noise, use that space to ask, what is a task I have been avoiding that actually matters? Boredom is a proof of the fact that man was made for a purpose, and without one, he begins to wither. 4. The essence of existence, responsibility. The true essence of human existence lies in responsibility. Life is not a vague abstraction. It is a series of concrete questions that every individual must answer through their actions. Frankl flips the traditional perspective on the meaning of life. He argues that we should not ask what the meaning of our life is, but rather we should realize that it is we who are being questioned by life. Every hour and every day, life poses a challenge to us, and we answer not through talk or meditation, but through right action and right conduct. To be human is to be responsible, to respond to these demands. This shift moves a person from being a passive victim of circumstances to an active protagonist in their own story. Frankl often shared a categorical imperative for logotherapy. Live as if you were living already for the second time, and as if you had acted the first time as wrongly as you are about to act now. He believed this mental exercise was the most powerful way to trigger a sense of responsibility. By imagining the present as a second chance to correct a past mistake, a person becomes acutely aware of their power to choose their next move wisely, even in the most restricted environments like a concentration camp. Meaning is found in the ought, the gap between who you are and who you could be. Responsibility is the bridge that crosses that gap. When faced with a difficult decision or a moment of lethargy, use Frankl's second life technique. Imagine you were looking back on this exact moment from the future. What action would your future self wish you had taken? Being human means being conscious and being responsible.
5. The meaning of suffering. Suffering is not a prerequisite for meaning, but meaning is possible despite suffering and even through it, provided that the suffering is unavoidable. Frankl argues that if suffering is avoidable, the meaningful thing to do is to remove its cause, such as seeking a cure for a treatable illness. However, when we face a fate we cannot change, an incurable disease or an inescapable loss, we are challenged to change ourselves. In these moments, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. We fulfill the highest value by the way in which we bear our burden. Frankl tells of an elderly general practitioner who consulted him because of severe depression following the death of his wife 2 years prior. Frankl asked him, "What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you?" The doctor replied that it would have been terrible for her. She would have suffered immensely. Frankl then pointed out that the doctor's own suffering had spared her that pain. By seeing his grief as a final act of love and protection for his wife, the doctor's suffering did not disappear, but his depression did. He now had a why for his pain. You do not need to be happy to have a meaningful life. Even in the depths of despair, you can achieve a tragic optimism, the ability to say yes to life in spite of everything. When you are in a situation you cannot change, ask yourself, what is this situation demanding of me? How can I endure this with a dignity that serves as an example to others or honors what I have lost? The way in which a man accepts his fate and all the suffering it entails gives him many opportunities, even under the most difficult circumstances, to add a deeper meaning to his life.
6. Logodrama, the super meaning. The ultimate meaning of life, the super meaning, transcends the finite grasp of human logic. It requires us to trust that there is a purpose to the whole of existence, even when we cannot see it. Frankl suggests that just as an animal cannot understand the purpose of a human's actions, like a lab animal being used for a life-saving vaccine, humans may not be able to fully comprehend the ultimate meaning of their own suffering within the vastness of the universe. This is not a call to blind faith, but a psychological necessity. To avoid despair, we must believe that our lives are part of a larger logos or order.
Logodrama is a technique where individuals are asked to look back on their lives from their deathbed to gain this objective bird's-eye perspective. Frankl describes a session with a woman who had lost one son and was left with another who was paralyzed. She had attempted suicide with the paralyzed son, but he had stopped her. During a group logodrama, Frankl asked her to imagine she was 80 years old, looking back on a life filled with success but no children, versus her current life. She realized that while her life was full of hardship, she had made a fuller life by staying for her son. By viewing her life as a completed drama from the future, the why of her struggle became visible. Meaning is not something we create out of thin air. It is something we discover already existing in the world. Even when life seems like a series of tragedies, there is a super meaning that connects the dots, even if we only see the full picture at the very end. When you feel overwhelmed by the pointlessness of a situation, zoom out. Imagine your life as a movie that is still being filmed. You are currently in a difficult scene, but the director, the super meaning, knows how this scene serves the final triumphant conclusion of the story. We do not need to understand the meaning of life to believe that life has meaning.
7. The collective neurosis. Every age has its own collective neurosis, and for the modern era, it is the existential vacuum, a widespread feeling of meaninglessness that manifests as a triad of depression, aggression, and addiction. Frankl argues that neurosis is not always an individual pathology. It can be a reflection of the culture. When a society loses its will to meaning, the void is filled by three destructive substitutes. First, depression, the unemployed neurosis, where lack of purpose leads to despair. Second, aggression, where the lack of a creative mission turns into destructive impulses. Third, addiction, where the search for meaning is replaced by the search for a chemical or digital high. Frankl warns that as long as we treat these as purely biological or social issues, we ignore the spiritual hunger at their core. Frankl often pointed to Sunday neurosis as a microcosm of this collective state. He observed that when the frantic pace of the work week ends, many people fall into a slump of depression or reckless behavior because they don't know what to do with their freedom. He also noted that among students, the will to meaning was often the strongest predictor of mental health. Those who felt their studies or future lives had a purpose were significantly less likely to succumb to the collective pressures of substance abuse or violence. Our modern epidemics of mental health are often symptoms of a starving spirit. If a person has nothing to live for, they will live for anything that numbs the pain of being aimless. Look at your own habits of consumption or flashes of anger. Ask yourself, am I actually upset or bored, or am I just lacking a project that demands my full attention? The cure for collective neurosis is the discovery of an individual task. The mass neurotic triad can only be overcome if we stop asking for happiness and start looking for meaning.
Segment 3. The 3 avenues to meaning. According to Frankl, we do not have to wait for meaning to strike us like lightning. We can actively discover it through 3 distinct avenues or pathways. These categories allow any person in any circumstance to find a reason to keep going. 1. The creative way, giving to the world. This is the most intuitive path, finding meaning in what we do or create. It involves the realization of a task, a project, or a creative work. Whether it is writing a book, building a business, or simply doing one's job with excellence, this avenue is about our unique contribution to the world. Frankl himself found this meaning by mentally reconstructing his stolen manuscript while in the camps, turning his suffering into a scientific contribution. 2. The experiential way, taking from the world. Meaning can also be found in what we experience or whom we encounter. This is the path of receptivity, finding meaning in the truth, beauty, and goodness of the world. It includes the appreciation of nature, the enjoyment of art, or most importantly, the experience of love. Frankl argues that by loving another person, we see the essential traits and potential in them that no one else sees, and in helping them realize that potential, we find our own meaning. 3. The attitudinal way, the stand we take. This is the most critical avenue, especially when the first two are blocked. When we face a fate we cannot change, such as an incurable disease or an inescapable tragedy, we still have the freedom to choose our attitude toward that suffering. We can transform a personal tragedy into a triumph. This is the human spirit's greatest achievement, the ability to turn a predicament into a human achievement. Meaning is not restricted to the successful, the healthy, or the lucky. If you cannot create and you cannot enjoy, you can still achieve meaning by the way you endure. If you feel stuck, look at these 3 doors. If you can't work, creative, look for something to appreciate or someone to love, experiential. If both are stripped away, focus on the dignity of your posture, attitudinal. Life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose.
Final summary. To conclude our exploration of Viktor Frankl's work, we must look at the synthesis of how a person moves from the depths of despair to the heights of self-transcendence. The central thesis of man's search for meaning is that the primary human drive is neither the pursuit of pleasure nor the struggle for power, but the discovery and fulfillment of meaning. This meaning is not a vague or universal abstraction. It is unique to each individual, objective in its existence within the world, and dynamic enough to change as our life circumstances evolve. At the heart of Frankl's philosophy are the 3 specific pathways to discovering this purpose. We find meaning through the creative way, by accomplishing tasks or contributing something unique to the world. We find it through the experiential way, by connecting with others through love or by appreciating the truth and beauty found in nature and art. Most importantly, when these are stripped away, we find meaning through the attitudinal way, the stand we take toward unavoidable suffering. By choosing how we respond to a fate we cannot change, we transform a personal tragedy into a human triumph. Frankl's final message is one of tragic optimism, a capacity to remain hopeful even when faced with the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death. He argues that pain can be turned into a human achievement, guilt into an opportunity for self-improvement, and the reality of death into an incentive to take responsible action while we still have time. This perspective shifts the focus from being a victim of our environment to being the architect of our internal life. Ultimately, the legacy of this work is the reminder that we are never fully determined by our circumstances. Between every external stimulus and our internal response, there exists a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our own path. As Frankl famously noted, everything can be taken from a person except the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. Personal reflection. The question life asks you. The most transformative shift in Frankl's logotherapy is the reversal of the meaning of life question. We often find ourselves frustrated, asking, what is life supposed to give me? Or what is the point of all this? Frankl suggests that these are the wrong questions. Instead, we should realize that it is life itself that asks us the questions. Every day, every hour, we are being interrogated by our circumstances. We answer not with words or grand philosophies, but with our actions and our decisions. Whether you are facing a professional setback, a personal loss, or simply the quiet boredom of a Sunday afternoon, the reflection is this: what is this moment demanding of me? When you stop looking for a universal answer and start responding to the specific tasks set before you, you move from a passive observer to the responsible author of your own existence. Critical analysis.
Logotherapy has faced criticism for its individualistic focus, with some arguing it places too much burden on the sufferer to find meaning in systems of oppression or biological illness that require structural or medical intervention. Critics also point out that Frankl's will to meaning is difficult to measure empirically compared to more clinical behavior-based therapies. However, its strength lies in its universality and resilience. Unlike traditional psychoanalysis, which often looks backward at trauma, logotherapy is future-oriented. It treats the human spirit not as a collection of drives and instincts, but as a center of freedom and responsibility. By bridging the gap between philosophy and psychology, Frankl created a framework that empowers individuals to reclaim their agency, even when their external world is in ruins. It remains a foundational text because it addresses the existential vacuum of the modern age, a problem that medication and wealth alone cannot solve. As we close the pages on Viktor Frankl's journey, we are left with a single, hauntingly beautiful truth. Meaning is not a luxury for the lucky, but a necessity for the living. Whether you are building a career, nurturing a relationship, or simply enduring a quiet hardship, the story between pages of your own life is still being written. The pen is in your hand, and the world is waiting for your response. If this breakdown of man's search for meaning helped you find a bit of clarity in the noise, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Story Between Pages for more deep dives into the books and military histories that define the human spirit. Your task for today? Don't look for the meaning of life in the abstract. Instead, identify one small, concrete task you've been avoiding, a conversation, a project, or a gesture of kindness, and complete it. Answer the question life is asking you right now.